The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory stretched wild and unforgiving beneath a merciless sun. In those days, a man's word still meant something, and a promise made to the dying carried the weight of Scripture. Captain James Brennan had made such a promise to his wife as she slipped away from fever 10 months prior, her final words a whisper that would alter the course of lives yet unborn. "Protect those like me." Margaret had breathed, her hand trembling in his. Only then, with death stealing her voice, had she revealed the truth she'd hidden for 13 years. Apache blood ran through her veins, a secret she'd buried so deep that even her daughters had never suspected. Jim had watched her die in their bedroom at the Verde Valley Ranch, helpless against an enemy no gun could defeat. And when the ground swallowed her body beneath the cottonwood tree she'd loved, he'd stood alone with 2 grieving daughters and a promise he didn't yet understand how to keep. But on this particular August morning, as his horse carried him across the sun-scorched earth toward the sound of distant gunfire, understanding was about to arrive with the force of revelation. 3 miles from his ranch, Jim spotted them. Dust rose in plumes against the copper sky, and through the shimmer of heat he could make out the shapes. 3 men on horseback, and between them a figure bound and walking. Even from this distance he recognized the posture, unbowed, unbroken. The woman stumbled, but did not fall. Her hands were tied behind her back, a rope around her neck, leading to the lead rider's saddle. She wore the practical clothing of survival buckskin worn soft by time, and weather-dark hair loose and tangled from days of being hunted. Jim's hand moved to his rifle without thought. These were bounty hunters, the kind who made their living dragging Apache refugees back to the reservations for government pay, the kind who didn't much care whether their cargo arrived breathing or not. He urged his mount forward, closing the distance at a steady gallop that would give them just enough warning, not enough to prepare, just enough to know death was coming. The lead rider saw him firsthand, jerking toward his sidearm. Jim's rifle spoke once, the crack echoing across the emptiness. The rope binding the woman snapped, cut clean by the bullet that passed 2 inches from her throat. She didn't hesitate. The moment the tension released, she dropped to her knees, twisted her bound hands beneath her feet, and came up running. Not away from the confrontation, toward it. The bounty hunters wheeled their horses, confusion giving way to anger. The lead man, a thick-necked brute with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, leveled his pistol at Jim. "That's government property, friend. Best you ride on." Jim kept his rifle steady, still mounted, still calm. The woman had reached a cluster of rocks and dropped behind them. Smart. She was giving him a clear field of fire and taking herself out of the crossfire in one move. "I don't see any government here," Jim said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who'd commanded troops through worse odds than 3-1. "I see 3 men trespassing on private land. You've got about 10 seconds to change that." The scarred man laughed, but it died in his throat when he got a better look at Jim's face. Recognition flickered there. Captain Brennan. Retired, yes, but the kind of officer whose reputation outlived his commission. "We got a legal claim," the man tried again, but his voice had lost its edge. $500 bounty on that squaw. You interfering with that, you're breaking territorial law." Jim's horse shifted beneath him, responding to some invisible cue. He'd trained this animal for 8 years. It knew the difference between conversation and combat. "I'll make you a counteroffer," Jim said. "I'll pay you the $500, right now, cash, and you'll ride out of here with your lives and your pride intact. Or you can try your luck, and I'll send you back to whatever hole you crawled out of in pieces." The math was simple even for men like these. 3 against 1 should favor them, except the one was Jim Brennan at 200 yards with a rifle, and they'd already seen what he could do with a moving target the width of a rope. The scarred man spat into the dust, cursed, but he holstered his weapon. "Show us the money first." Jim reached slowly into his saddlebag, never taking his eyes from the 3 men, never lowering the rifle more than necessary. The leather pouch he pulled out was heavy with coins, the accumulation of 6 months of careful saving. Money he'd set aside for winter supplies, for the girls' schooling, for the 1,000 small necessities of keeping a ranch alive. He tossed it to the ground halfway between them. The youngest of the 3 bounty hunters, barely more than a boy with wispy facial hair and nervous eyes, dismounted to retrieve it. Counted the coins with shaking fingers, nodded to his companions. "It's all here." "Then our business is concluded," Jim said, each word precise, final. "But understand this. If I see any of you within 20 miles of my property again, I won't be making offers. I'll be digging graves." They rode out, the scarred man glaring back once before distance, and dust swallowed them. Jim waited until they'd disappeared completely, until even the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the eternal silence of the desert. Only then did he lower his rifle. Only then did he turn toward the rocks where the woman had taken shelter. She stood slowly still, wary hands still bound. Her eyes were dark as obsidian and just as hard, taking his measure with the practiced assessment of someone who'd learned that survival meant trusting nothing at first glance. Jim dismounted, moving with deliberate slowness. He pulled his knife, and her body tensed. "Easy," he said quietly. "Just the ropes." He cut her bonds with 2 quick motions, stepping back immediately to give her space. She rubbed her wrists, circulation returning in painful tingles he could see her fighting to ignore. "You can run," Jim said, nodding toward the open desert. "Or you can come with me. There's water at my ranch, food, a place to rest." She studied him for a long moment. Her gaze traveled from his weathered face to his worn boots, reading the truth of a man in the details others overlooked. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied some internal calculation, because she nodded once. "I will come." Her voice was lower than he'd expected, roughened by thirst, but steady. She moved toward his horse with the fluid economy of someone born to the saddle, then paused. "But I am not property. Not yours, not theirs, not anyone's." Jim met her eyes and saw no supplication there, no gratitude, just a statement of fact delivered with the weight of absolute conviction. "I know," he said, "but they don't need to know that." Something shifted in her expression then, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement, an understanding between 2 people who'd learned that sometimes survival meant playing roles others expected while keeping your truth locked safe inside. They rode together in silence, her seated behind him, hands resting lightly on his waist for balance. The sun climbed higher, brutal and indifferent, as the miles fell away beneath the horse's steady rhythm. The ranch appeared on the horizon like a promise made solid. Cottonwoods marked the presence of water. Outbuildings spoke of prosperity maintained through relentless work. The main house, built from adobe and timber, stood 2 stories tall with a wide porch that offered shade during the merciless afternoon hours. Jim helped her down, noting the way she winced when her feet hit the ground. Days of forced marching had taken their toll, though she'd die before admitting it. "There's a room in the barn," he said. "Clean. Private. You can rest there while I figure out what happens next." She nodded, following him toward the structure. The barn smelled of hay and horses, and the particular comfort of well-maintained space. Jim showed her to a corner room he sometimes used when late-night emergencies with the livestock made the trip back to the house impractical. It had a cot, a basin for washing, a small window that let in light and air. "I'll bring water," he said, turning to leave. "Your shoulder." He paused. Her eyes were fixed on his left side, where an old wound sometimes troubled him when the weather turned. He'd thought he was hiding the stiffness well enough. Apparently not. "Old injury, nothing to concern yourself with." She moved past him without asking permission, fingers probing the joint with surprising gentleness. Through the fabric of his shirt she could feel the knots of scar tissue, the way the muscle had healed imperfectly around shattered bone. 3 years old," she said. It wasn't a question. "The bone set wrong. You have pain in winter." "How did you know?" She disappeared briefly, returning with plants he recognized from the property, but had never known were useful. Her hands worked quickly, crushing leaves to release their oils, mixing them with water from the basin. "This will help." The pain, not the old break. Some things cannot be unmade. She applied the poultice without waiting for his consent, and Jim found himself too surprised to object. The cooling sensation was immediate, followed by a deeper warmth that seemed to penetrate all the way to the bone. "You're a healer," he said. "I am someone who keeps people alive." The distinction seemed important to her. "That is different from healing. Healing means making whole. I can only stop the dying." A sound from the barn entrance made them both turn. 2 girls stood there, backlit by the afternoon sun. Emma, 11 years old, and already showing the serious demeanor of someone who'd learned too young that life could be cruel. Grace, 7, still young enough for wonder, but old enough to remember her mother. They stared at the woman with undisguised curiosity. She looked back without embarrassment, taking their measure as carefully as she'd taken their father's. "Ya ati," she said softly. The Apache greeting hung in the air like a bridge thrown across an impossible distance. Grace's face lit up with delight. She tried to mimic the sounds, mangling the pronunciation in the charming way of children who haven't yet learned to be afraid of mistakes. Emma laughed, a sound Jim hadn't heard from her in months. The woman's lips curved slightly, almost a smile. Close enough. "Your daughters," she said to Jim. Not a question. "Yes, they have your eyes, but the laugh belongs to someone else." The observation cut deeper than any blade. Margaret's laugh echoing through time in the voice of a child. "Their mother," Jim said quietly. "She passed last winter." The woman nodded, understanding, flickering across her features. She'd known loss too. It lived in the lines around her eyes, in the careful way she held herself apart from comfort. "I am Tyan," she said. "It means beautiful moon in my language, though I have not felt beautiful in many years, and the moon sees too much that should remain hidden. Jim Brennan, these are Emma and Grace." Grace, with the fearlessness of the very young, stepped forward. "Can you teach me more words?" Tyan glanced at Jim, seeking permission. He nodded. "What would you like to know? How do you say horse?" "Way." Grace tried it, failed, tried again. Tyan corrected her gently, showing her how to shape the sound. Emma drifted closer, drawn by curiosity, stronger than caution. Jim left them there, three souls, finding unexpected common ground in the simple act of language. He walked to the house, his mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. He'd saved this woman on impulse, driven by a promise he'd made to a dying wife. But what happened now? He couldn't keep her here indefinitely. The bounty hunters would report the loss of their prize. Questions would be asked. And yet, watching through the window as his daughters smiled for the first time in months, laughing as they learned to wrap their tongues around foreign syllables, Jim felt something shift in his chest. Not love, not yet, but recognition of possibility. Maybe Margaret's dying wish hadn't been about justice or politics or grand gestures. Maybe it had been simpler than that. Maybe she just wanted her daughters to know that family could take different shapes. That home could be built from unexpected materials. He was still standing there, lost in thought, when Grace's scream tore through the afternoon quiet. Jim ran. His feet carried him across the yard before conscious thought could catch up, rifle grabbed from where he'd left it by the door. Emma was backing away from something, her face sheet white. Grace stood frozen, staring down at the ground. A rattlesnake, thick as a man's forearm, and angrier than sin, coiled 3 feet from Grace's leg. Its tail buzzed a warning that turned Jim's blood cold. One strike at that distance, and the child would be dead before they could get her to the doctor in town. Tyan moved. She didn't run, didn't shout. She simply dropped into a crouch, grabbed a stick from the ground, and in one fluid motion, pinned the snake's head. Her other hand seized it behind the skull fingers, finding the exact pressure points to immobilize the creature. "Grace," she said, voice absolutely calm, "step backward. Slowly. Do not run." The girl obeyed, tears streaming down her face, but her movements controlled. Emma rushed to pull her sister the rest of the way to safety. Tyan stood the snake, writhing in her grip. She carried it away from the buildings, far into the scrub, and released it with a flick of her wrist that sent it tumbling into the rocks. When she returned, Grace threw herself at Tyan's legs, sobbing. The woman's hands, which had moments ago held death captive, now rested gently on the child's head. "The snake was afraid," Tyan said quietly. "Like you. It only wanted to be left alone." "But you weren't afraid," Grace hiccuped. "I was. Fear is not shameful. But fear must not be allowed to choose our actions. You stayed still. That was brave. That was right." Jim watched this exchange with something like awe. In the span of 30 seconds, this woman had moved from stranger to savior. More than that, she'd turned a moment of terror into a lesson delivered with such matter-of-fact wisdom that Grace was nodding through her tears. "Can you teach me," Emma asked suddenly, "how to do that, how to catch snakes, if your father permits?" 3 pairs of eyes turned to Jim. He saw the question there, layered with meanings too complex to unpack in a single moment. "Yes," he heard himself say. "She can stay, for now." That night, after the girls had gone to bed, still chattering about their adventure, Jim found Tyan sitting on the porch staring out at the darkness. He brought 2 cups of coffee, strong and bitter, the way ranch living demanded. "Thank you," he said, "for Grace. I did what needed doing. No thanks required." They sat in silence, sipping coffee while coyotes sang their evening chorus. The desert breathed around them, ancient and patient. "My wife," Jim said finally. "Margaret. Before she died, she told me something. About herself. About her blood." Tyan's stillness suggested she was listening, though she didn't turn. She was Apache. Her grandmother, anyway, she hid it her whole life, was terrified someone would find out, that they'd take her children, that I'd leave her. "Did you know? Not until the end. She made me promise to protect people like her, people caught between worlds. I didn't understand what she meant then. And now I think maybe I'm starting to." Tyan finally looked at him. In the lamplight spilling from the windows, her face was plains and shadows. "Your wife was wise to fear," she said. "The world does not forgive those who refuse to choose a side, and it punishes most harshly those who are born without the luxury of choice." Before Jim could respond, hoofbeats sounded in the distance. Multiple riders moving fast. He stood hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. 4 soldiers crested the Rise Union cavalry uniforms, stark against the night. Leading them was a man Jim recognized with a sinking sensation in his gut, Major Cyrus Blackwood. They'd served together once back when Jim still believed wars could be won with honor intact. That belief hadn't survived contact with Blackwood's particular brand of warfare. The major dismounted with the confident swagger of a man who'd never learned to doubt his own righteousness. He was 50 now, hair gone silver at the temple's face, weathered to leather by sun and cruelty in equal measure. Captain Brennan, Blackwood said, the old rank deployed like a weapon. "I heard you'd acquired some Apache property. Thought I'd come to see for myself. I'm retired, Blackwood. It's just Jim now, and I don't have any property here that concerns you." Blackwood's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "That's not what I heard. 3 bounty hunters came through Fort Verde this afternoon madder than hornets. Said you stole their legal bounty right out from under them. I paid them fair price." "Did you now?" Blackwood's gaze slid past Jim to where Tyann stood in the doorway, face unreadable. "That her, the Apache. She's a hired hand. Helps with the ranch. Is that so?" Blackwood pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "Because I have a warrant here. Seems this particular Apache is wanted for murder. 2 soldiers killed during a raid near Camp Grant, back in '71. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Jim knew it was a lie. Camp Grant had been a massacre, not a raid. Women and children slaughtered while the men were away. But lies wrapped in official documents carried more weight than truth spoken by the powerless. "That warrant isn't worth the paper it's printed on," Jim said, "and you know it." "What I know," Blackwood said, voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, "is that you're harboring a fugitive, and that's a problem. See, this ranch sits on some valuable land, real valuable, the kind of valuable that could make a retired officer very wealthy if he played his cards right." There it was, the real agenda laid bare. This wasn't about justice or law. It was about the silver deposits Jim's survey had found last spring. Deposits he'd kept quiet, hoping to mine them slowly, carefully, without drawing attention. Somehow Blackwood had found out. "So here's how this is going to work," Blackwood continued. "I'm going to give you 30 days to sell me this ranch. Fair price, of course. And you're going to turn over that Apache to proper authorities. Or," he smiled again, "or I'll be forced to bring you up on charges, harboring fugitives. Maybe we'll throw in some questions about how you're raising those daughters of yours, whether a man who consorts with savages is fit to be a father." The threat landed like a physical blow. Jim's hands clenched at his sides, every instinct screaming to throw this man off his property by force. But Blackwood had 4 armed soldiers with him, and more importantly, he had the law on his side. Corrupt law, twisted law, but law nonetheless. "Get off my land," Jim said quietly. Blackwood mounted his horse, still smiling. 30 days, Captain. Think carefully about what you're willing to lose." They rode out, leaving dust and menace in their wake. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded, Jim turned to find Emma and Grace standing behind Tyann, faces frightened in the lamplight. "Papa," Emma's voice was small. "What's going to happen?" Jim looked at his daughters. At Tyann, standing straight-backed and defiant, despite knowing she was the spark that had lit this particular fire. At the ranch, his wife had loved the land that was supposed to be his children's inheritance. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I promise you this. We're going to figure it out together." Grace moved to Tyann's side, small hand slipping into the woman's larger one. "Don't let them take her, Papa, please." It was Emma who sealed it, though. Emma, who'd been silent and withdrawn since her mother's death. Emma, who'd forgotten how to smile until today. "She's family now," Emma said. Simply, finally. As if it were the most obvious truth in the world. And perhaps it was. Perhaps family had never been about blood or law or what the world deemed proper. Perhaps it had always been about who showed up when the rattlesnakes came, who taught you to be brave, who stood beside you when powerful men made threats. Jim looked at Tyann and saw her eyes shining with something that might have been tears if she'd allowed herself that luxury. "Then we fight," he said. "All of us. Together." The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and creosote and the promise of storms yet to come. Inside the ranch house, a family that shouldn't exist by any conventional measure gathered close, while outside the darkness pressed in with all the weight of a world that had never learned to forgive those who dared to love across the lines it had drawn. But morning would come. It always did. And with it, the first real battle in a war none of them had chosen, but all of them would fight. Because some promises once made became more than words. They became destiny. The attack came 3 nights later, announced by the restless shifting of horses in the corral and the sudden silence of night birds who knew predators when they sensed them. Tyann woke first. She'd been sleeping light since Blackwood's visit, her body remembering lessons learned through 7 years of running. The wrongness in the air prickled across her skin like static before a lightning storm. She was dressed and moving before conscious thought caught up to instinct. She found Jim already awake in the main house, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the darkness through the window. "You feel it too," he said. Not a question. 4 men, maybe 5, coming from the east using the arroyo for cover. She pointed to shadows that looked no different from any other shadows, but Jim had learned not to question how she knew things. "They will try to burn us out." "The barn first," Jim said, following her logic. "Destroy the livestock, leave us with nothing. And when we run out to save the animals, they will have clear shots." They looked at each other in the dim lamplight, and something unspoken passed between them. Trust, the kind earned through shared danger rather than given freely. "Wake the girls," Tyen said. "Bring them to the root cellar. They will be safe there below ground stone walls." "What are you going to do?" "What I learned to do when I was younger than Emma. Survive." She moved through the house like smoke, gathering what she needed. A blanket, a water skin, dried sage from the bundle hanging in the kitchen. Her hands worked with practiced efficiency, muscle memory, from a life lived on the knife edge between breathing and bleeding out. Jim roused his daughters with gentle urgency. Grace whimpered, still caught between sleep and waking, but Emma's eyes snapped open with the terrible alertness of a child who'd already learned the world was not safe. "Is it the bad men?" Emma whispered. "Yes, sweetheart, but we're ready for them. Tyen has a plan." In the root cellar, surrounded by sacks of potatoes and jars of preserves that Margaret had put up in better days, the girls huddled together. Tyen knelt before them, her dark eyes reflecting lamplight like polished stones. "Listen carefully," she said, voice low and steady. "When the fire starts, men will shout. There will be gunshots. You will be frightened. This is natural. Fear keeps us alive when we listen to it properly." "What do we do?" Grace asked, voice trembling. "You stay here. You stay quiet. And you remember that fear and panic are different things. Fear says be careful. Panic says do something foolish. Never let panic choose your actions." Emma nodded, trying to look brave. Tyen touched her cheek gently. "Your mother was Apache," she said quietly. "That means you carry the blood of survivors, women who outlasted armies, women who turned stone and sand into home. That strength is in you. Trust it." Jim's head snapped up. "How did you know about Margaret?" "The way you looked at me when I sang yesterday. The way your daughters learn my language, as if remembering rather than discovering. Some truths do not need words." She stood adjusting the blanket across her shoulders. "Now we go. They are almost in position." Outside, the night was vast and terrible in its indifference. Stars burned cold overhead, while men moved through darkness with murder on their minds. Jim took his position on the porch rifle. Ready eyes scanning for movement. Tyen disappeared into the shadows near the barn. Jim lost sight of her almost immediately, which was exactly the point. She'd shown him over the past 3 days how Apache fighters used terrain, how they became part of the landscape rather than moving through it. The first torch arced through the air like a fallen star landing on the barn's wooden roof. Flames caught immediately, fed by dry timber and summer heat. And a second torch followed, then a third. "Now," someone shouted from the darkness. "When they come out, take them." But Jim didn't move. He stayed low, weapon ready, trusting Tyen's plan even though every instinct screamed at him to save his livestock, his winter feed, his livelihood going up in smoke. 3 men rushed forward from the arroyo, emboldened by the lack of response. They carried rifles and wore the confident swagger of hunters who believed their prey was cornered. They were wrong. Tyen rose from the ground itself, or so it seemed. The blanket she'd wrapped around herself was the exact color of desert sand, and she'd positioned herself in a shallow depression that made her invisible until she chose to move. She didn't shout, didn't announce herself. She simply acted. The first man went down with a rock the size of a fist, catching him behind the ear. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings, rifle clattering away. The second man spun toward the sound and met Tyen's shoulder in his solar plexus, all her weight and momentum driving the air from his lungs. He crumpled, gasping. The third man got his rifle up, finger tightening on the trigger. Jim's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. Non-lethal as they'd agreed. Dead men couldn't answer questions. 2 more attackers broke cover, realizing their ambush had become a trap. Jim fired twice more, forcing them to dive for protection behind the water trough. Tyen was already moving, circling wide, using the firelight and shadows to make herself impossible to track. She came at them from an angle they weren't watching, low and fast. Her foot caught the first man's knee, hyperextending it with an audible pop. He screamed, going down hard. The last man standing whirled and found himself staring down the barrel of Jim's rifle at 10 feet. "Don't," Jim said quietly. "I'm tired. I'm angry. And I'm very, very good at this. Give me a reason." The man's hands went up slowly. His face, illuminated by the burning barn, was young. Barely 20, with the kind of soft features that said he'd never gone hungry, never known real consequence for his actions. "We weren't going to hurt nobody," he stammered. "Just scare you a little." "Fire scares horses," Tyen said, emerging from the darkness at his back. "Scared horses break legs, die slowly. You were going to hurt plenty." Jim kept his rifle steady while Tyen gathered the attackers' weapons, tossing them into a pile well away from their owners. The young one kept talking, nervous energy spilling out in a flood of words. "Major Blackwood, he said it'd be easy. Said you'd run, sell up, move on. Said the Apache witch wouldn't be no trouble." "Which?" Tyen repeated, voice flat. "Because I know which plants heal and which kill. Because I can read the land like you read a newspaper. This makes me a witch." "I didn't mean nothing by it, ma'am. Just repeating what the major said." Jim moved closer, studying the young man's face. "What else did Blackwood say, specifically?" "He wants your land, bad. Says there's silver in them hills enough to make a man rich as any railroad baron. Says you got no right to it, being friendly with Indians and all. Says—" He hesitated. "Finish it," Jim commanded, using the tone that had made soldiers jump during his command days. "Says he'll get it one way or another, legal if he can, other ways if he has to, and he said that Apache blood, it don't deserve to mix with white. Said it was his Christian duty to cleanse the territory." A cold fury settled over Jim's features. This wasn't just about silver or land. This was about the same poison that had driven Margaret to hide her heritage, that had killed hundreds at Camp Grant, that justified atrocity with scripture and righteousness. "Tie them up," he told Tyen. "We'll take them to Marshal Holloway in the morning. Let the law sort this out." They worked quickly, using rope from the barn that was somehow still standing, despite the flames that had scorched its roof. The fire was dying now, having found less fuel than expected. Jim had soaked the barn's timbers with water from the irrigation ditch just that afternoon, following Tyen's suggestion. The damage was ugly, but survivable. By the time they'd secured all 5 attackers, dawn was threatening the eastern horizon with pale light. Jim sent Tyen to fetch the girls while he stood guard, watching the captured men with eyes that promised swift justice if any of them moved wrong. Emma and Grace emerged from the cellar wide-eyed but unharmed. Grace ran straight to Tyen, wrapping her arms around the woman's waist. "You came back," the child said, voice muffled against fabric. "I promised I would. I keep my promises." Emma approached more slowly, taking in the scene with her usual careful assessment. "Did you kill them?" "No," Tyen said. "Dead men cannot tell truth. Living men, frightened men, they talk freely." "Good." Emma's voice was hard, older than her years. "I want everyone to know what they tried to do." As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and copper, they loaded the prisoners onto horses and began the ride into Verde Falls. Jim led rifle across his saddle. Tyen rode beside him, Emma and Grace behind them, a family by choice, if not by law. The journey took 3 hours, and by the time they reached town, word had spread. People lined the streets, watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. Jim ignored them all, riding straight to the marshal's office. Ben Holloway was 55 years old, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of walking the line between law and justice. He stepped out onto the wooden boardwalk as they approached, thumbs hooked in his belt, eyes taking in the scene with professional interest. "Jim," he said carefully, "you want to tell me why you're bringing me half of Blackwood's ranch hands, trussed up like Christmas turkeys? They attacked my property last night. Arson. Attempted murder if we'd played it the way they expected." Jim gestured to the young one. "That one's feeling talkative. Might want to hear what he has to say about who gave the orders." Holloway's jaw tightened. He'd served in the territorial law for 20 years, and he knew exactly what kind of man Cyrus Blackwood was. Knew it, but proving it was another matter entirely. "Bring them inside," he said finally. "All of you. This is going to take some sorting." The marshal's office smelled of coffee and old tobacco documents and desperation. Holloway listened while Jim and Tyen recounted the night's events, his expression growing darker with each detail. The young attacker, separated from his companions and scared sober, confirmed everything. "So Blackwood wants you gone," Holloway said when they'd finished. "Wants the land, wants the Apache woman handed over, and he's willing to use violence to make it happen." "That about covers it," Jim agreed. "Problem is, I can charge these boys with arson and assault. But connecting it to Blackwood, that's harder. He's smart enough to keep his hands clean to use middlemen and suggestion instead of direct orders." "Then what do we do?" Emma asked, her young voice cutting through the adult conversation. Just let him win. Holloway looked at the girl, and something in his weathered face softened. No, child. We fight smart. We use the law he thinks he controls, turn it back on him. He turned to Jim. You got a lawyer? Can't afford one. Well, you're going to need one, because Blackwood's next move will be legal. He'll come at you through the courts, try to take those girls on grounds of moral unfitness, try to force a sale of your property. And without representation, you won't stand a chance. The words hung in the air like a sentence already passed. Jim felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders, the impossible mathematics of fighting a man with money and connections while trying to keep a ranch alive and 2 daughters safe. Tyann had been silent through most of this, standing near the window, watching the street. Now she turned, and there was something fierce in her eyes. In my culture, she said quietly, when one family cannot stand alone, others stand with them. You call it alliance. We call it survival. She looked at Jim. You saved me, fed me, gave me a place to heal. Now I will help you fight. With respect, ma'am, Holloway said gently, you're part of what he's using against Jim. Your presence here gives him ammunition. Then we make my presence a strength instead of a weakness. We find others who have been hurt by Blackwood, others who want justice but fear to stand alone. We gather them together until we are too many to ignore. Jim studied her, seeing the steel beneath the calm exterior. This was a woman who'd survived massacre, who'd walked through 7 years of hatred and hunting with her dignity intact. If she said there was a way to fight, he believed her. All right, he said. We build an alliance. Where do we start? Holloway leaned back in his chair, thinking. There's Doc Ellen Hayes. She's had run-ins with Blackwood over treatment of Apache prisoners. And Father Santos at the mission. He's not afraid to speak up when he sees injustice. He paused. And there's others. Folks Blackwood has squeezed or threatened. Might be they'd stand up if they thought they had a chance of winning. The plan began to take shape, built from desperation and hope in equal measure. They would gather allies, document Blackwood's crimes, build a case so strong that even territorial corruption couldn't ignore it. But as they talked, Jim felt a cold certainty settling in his gut. Blackwood wouldn't wait for legal proceedings to run their course. He'd already shown his willingness to use violence. The next attack would come, and it would be worse. They rode home in the afternoon heat, the girls tired but resilient, clinging to Tyann like she was an anchor in a storm. And perhaps she was. Perhaps they all were for each other, a makeshift family forged in the fire of shared struggle. That night, after the girls had finally fallen asleep, their breathing deep and even, Jim and Tyann sat on the porch. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of people far below. Tell me about Camp Grant, Jim said quietly. Tyann was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she began to speak, her voice low and steady, painting pictures of horror in the darkness. April 30th, 1871. I was 19 years old. The men had gone hunting as they did. We thought we were safe. The army had promised protection. We believed them. Her hands clenched in her lap. They came at dawn. White men, Mexicans. Tohono O'odham who hated us. More than 100 attackers against women and children and old men who could not fight. How many died? 144. Most were women. Many were children. They took the babies who survived, sold them into slavery in Mexico. I lived because I had gone to gather healing plants. When I returned, the screaming had stopped. There was only silence and smoke and blood. Jim closed his eyes against the images her words conjured. Blackwood was there. I heard his voice, giving orders, laughing. The word came out like a curse. I was hiding in the rocks. I saw his face. I have never forgotten it. Then we'll make sure no one else forgets either, Jim said. We'll make him answer for it. Tyann turned to look at him, and in the starlight, her face was both young and ancient. Why? Why risk everything for me? For justice that will not bring back the dead? Jim thought of Margaret's final words, thought of his daughters learning to be brave, thought of the kind of man he wanted to be when this was all over. Because some fights are worth having even if you know you might lose. Because teaching my girls that right matters more than easy is more important than keeping them safe from every possible harm. And because, he paused, finding truth in the words as he spoke them, because you're family now, and family is worth fighting for. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called. Another answered. The desert breathed around them, patient and eternal. Tomorrow would bring new battles. Tomorrow would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, on this porch under these stars, they were not alone, and that Jim thought might just be enough. The town of Verde Falls had been built where water met desperation, a collection of adobe and timber structures clinging to existence through sheer stubbornness. On a good day, it housed maybe 300 souls. On this particular morning, it seemed every one of them had found reason to be on the main street. Jim felt their eyes like physical weight as he rode in with his family. Tyan sat tall beside him, Grace perched in front of her on the saddle, small hands gripping the woman's arms with complete trust. Emma rode her own mount, chin lifted in defiance of the stares and whispers that followed their passage. "Papa," Emma said quietly, "they're all looking at us." "Let them look," Jim replied. "We've got nothing to be ashamed of." But shame wasn't what he saw in those faces. Fear, yes. Curiosity, certainly. Anger in some, and in others, something that might have been approval carefully hidden behind neutral expressions. Verde Falls was a town that had learned long ago to keep opinions private until it was safe to voice them aloud. They hitched their horses outside the general store, and Jim helped Grace down. The girl's legs were unsteady after the long ride, but she recovered quickly, reaching immediately for Tyan's hand. "We need supplies," Jim said, more to establish their purpose than anything else. "Coffee flour, some fabric if they have anything suitable." They stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, boots echoing hollow against the planks. The general store's door stood open, but the proprietor, a pinched-faced man named Amos Tucker, made no move to welcome them. He simply watched, arms crossed, as they approached. "Morning, Amos," Jim said evenly. "Brennan." No greeting, just acknowledgement. Tucker's eyes slid to Tyan, then away, as if looking too long might somehow contaminate him. "I heard you had some trouble out at your place." "Nothing we couldn't handle." "Also heard you're keeping an Apache, as hired help, you said." Tucker's tone made it clear he didn't believe the story. Before Jim could answer, a voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "Well, well, if it ain't the Indian lover and his pet squaw." Luther Pike stepped out from the alley beside the store, flanked by two other men, cut from the same rough cloth. Pike was 35 and mean with it, the kind of man who'd found his calling in violence and never looked for anything better. He was Blackwood's right hand, the one who did the work the Major wanted done without getting his own hands dirty. Jim moved instinctively, positioning himself between Pike and his family. But Emma was faster, her young voice ringing out clear and furious. "Don't you talk about her like that." Pike's laugh was ugly. "Little girl's got spirit. Shame she's being raised by a man who doesn't know which side of the line he belongs on." He spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "You know what we do with traitors, Brennan, what we do with white men who lie down with savages." The street had gone quiet. People who'd been going about their business now stood frozen, waiting to see how this would play out. Jim could feel the moment crystallizing, becoming one of those turning points where everything afterward would be different. "Pike," he said quietly, "you've got about 5 seconds to apologize to my daughter and walk away. After that, things are going to get unpleasant." "Your daughter?" Pike made it sound obscene. "Which one? The white ones you're letting go wild, or the Apache whore you're pretending to employ?" The insult was calculated, designed to provoke. Jim knew it. Knew also that Pike wanted him to throw the first punch to give Blackwood legal grounds to move against him. But before Jim could decide how to respond, Tyan stepped forward. She moved with the same fluid grace she'd shown fighting off the night attackers, but there was no violence in her posture now, just absolute certainty. "I am no man's whore," she said, voice carrying to every watching face. "I am a healer. I am a teacher. I am a woman who has survived things you cannot imagine, and I am not afraid of you." Pike's face flushed red. "You don't talk to me, squaw. You don't even look at me. You're less than dirt under my boots." "Then why are you so afraid of me?" The question landed like a stone in still water ripples spreading outward. Pike's hand moved toward his gun, and the street held its breath. "That's enough!" Marshal Holloway's voice cut through the tension. He'd emerged from his office across the street, hand resting casually on his own sidearm. Not threatening, just present, just ready. "Pike, you've made your opinion known. Now move along before I decide public disturbance needs a few days in jail to cool off." Pike's eyes darted between the Marshal, Jim, and Tyen, math happening behind those mean little eyes. Finally he spat again and turned away, shouldering past his companions. "This ain't over, Brennan," he called back. "Not by a long shot." They watched him go, tension slowly bleeding from the air. But before anyone could speak, Emma's voice rang out again, clear as a bell, and twice as loud. "Don't you dare talk to my mother like that." The word hung in the air. Mother. Public. Undeniable. Emma stood with her fists clenched, face flushed with anger and something else. Something fierce and protective and absolutely certain. She looked at Tyen, then at her father, daring either of them to contradict her. Tyen's face had gone very still. Jim saw the shock there quickly hidden, but not before he'd glimpsed the raw emotion underneath. This woman who'd survived massacre, who'd walked through 7 years of being hunted, who'd learned to wall off her heart against further loss, she was undone by a child's claim. Grace, not understanding the weight of what her sister had just done, but recognizing the rightness of it, nodded vigorously. She is our mother. She takes care of us. She teaches us things. That's what mothers do. The watching townspeople stirred. Some faces hardened further. Others softened. Amos Tucker made a small sound that might have been disgust or might have been something else and disappeared into the back of his store, but one woman, gray-haired and weathered, stepped forward. Jim recognized her as Sarah Chen, who ran the boarding house on the edge of town. She was Chinese, had come to Arizona during the railroad boom, and knew something about being unwelcome in places she had every right to be. "My store has the fabric you need," she said quietly to Jim. "Better quality than Amos stocks anyway. Come, I'll show you." It was a small thing, an invitation to follow, but in that moment it felt like the shifting of mountains. They walked together down the street, leaving whispers in their wake. Sarah's shop was smaller than Tucker's, but everything in it spoke of care and attention. Bolts of fabric arranged by color, jars of spices labeled in elegant script, a pot of tea always warm on the stove. "Sit," Sarah said, gesturing to chairs near the window. The children looked tired. Emma and Grace sank gratefully into the seats. Sarah poured tea without asking, handing cups to everyone, including Tyan. The simple courtesy of it, the assumption that they were all equally deserving of hospitality, made Jim's throat tight. "I heard what happened at your ranch," Sarah said as she measured out flour and coffee. "I heard also what you did, taking her in, standing against Blackwood." She paused, looking directly at Tyan. "That takes courage or foolishness. Often they look the same." "We didn't have much choice," Jim said. "There is always choice. You could have turned her over. Could have taken Blackwood's offer and moved somewhere safer." Sarah wrapped the purchases in brown paper, her hands efficient and sure. "Instead, you chose the hard path. The right one, I think, but hard." "You're not afraid of Blackwood." Sarah's smile was thin and knowing. "I am terrified of him. He has made life difficult for anyone who looks different, speaks different, believes different. But fear and action are not opposites. I can be afraid and still do what is right." She handed Jim the packages, then reached under the counter and produced a sealed envelope. "Give this to Marshal Holloway. It is my testimony about Blackwood's treatment of Chinese workers. Times he withheld wages. Times he threatened violence. All written down, all dated. I have been waiting for someone to stand up to him. Perhaps now is the time." Jim took the envelope with something like awe. "You'd risk that for us, for justice," Sarah corrected gently. "You are not the first family Blackwood has tried to destroy. You are simply the first with courage enough to fight back publicly. That makes you dangerous to him. But it also makes you hope for the rest of us." As they left Sarah's shop, Jim noticed other small changes. A nod from the blacksmith. A careful smile from the schoolteacher. Not everyone, not even most, but enough to suggest that the town's silence wasn't unanimity. They made one more stop before leaving Verde Falls. The mission of San Miguel stood at the southern edge of town, its whitewashed walls bright against the brown earth. Father Miguel Santos had served there for 20 years, ministering to a congregation that included Mexicans, Yaquis, a few Apache, and anyone else the main church considered too problematic. He met them at the door, a small man with white hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering to judge anyone harshly. Come in," he said, his accent thick, but his English clear. "I have been expecting you." The mission's interior was cool and dim, offering relief from the afternoon heat. Wooden pews worn smooth by decades of use, statues of saints watching from alcoves with patient eyes, the smell of incense and candle wax and faith tested by fire. Father Santos produced milk and sweetbread for the girls, settling them on a pew while he spoke with Jim and Tyen. "Marshal Holloway told me you would come," he explained. He said you are building a case against Major Blackwood. He said you need witnesses." The old priest's hands trembled slightly as he poured water from a clay pitcher. "I will testify about the Apache prisoners he denied medical care, about the families he separated, about the cruelties I have witnessed and been powerless to stop." "Father, if you do this, he'll come after you too," Jim warned. "Then let him come. I am an old man. I have made my peace with God. What can Blackwood take from me that death will not claim soon enough anyway?" He smiled, but there was steel beneath the gentleness. "Besides, the Lord does not distinguish between white skin and red, between conqueror and conquered. We are all his children, all equally deserving of justice and mercy." Tyen had been silent through most of this conversation, but now she spoke, her voice rough with emotion. "Why, you do not know me. Why risk yourself? Father Santos looked at her with infinite compassion. Because I knew your mother. The words fell like stones into deep water. Tyan went very still. Camp Grant, the priest continued softly. Before the massacre I would visit sometimes. Bring medicine here, confessions from the Catholic converts. Your mother, she would help me. Translate. Make sure I understood the people's needs. He paused, remembering. She was kind, wise. She sang while she worked. You have her voice. Tyan's composure cracked. Not much. Just enough that Jim saw the tears she refused to let fall. You were there? After, I came when I heard. Too late to save anyone, but I buried them with prayers everyone I could find. Your mother, I remember her especially. I said the rosary over her grave. I have said it every year since, on the anniversary of that terrible day. A sound escaped Tyan, then something between grief and gratitude. Emma, hearing it, slipped from her pew and came to stand beside the woman who'd become her mother in all but law. Small hand finding larger one. Silent support. Father Santos blessed them all before they left, making the sign of the cross over each forehead. Even Tyan, who did not share his faith, bowed her head to receive it. Some gestures transcend belief. The ride home was quiet, each of them lost in thought, but it was a different quiet than before. Not the silence of isolation, but the peace of knowing they weren't alone. As the ranch came into view, its familiar contours softened by late afternoon light, Grace stirred from her half-doze. Papa, she said sleepily, are we going to win? Jim thought about Sarah Chen's envelope, about Father Santos's promise to testify, about the way some people in town had looked at them with something other than hatred, about Emma's fierce declaration and Tyan's quiet strength. I don't know, sweetheart, he answered honestly, but we're going to fight like hell either way. Tyan glanced at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled, really smiled. It transformed her face, made her look young, and hopeful, despite everything she'd survived. Then we have already won something, she said. We have shown your daughters that some things are worth fighting for, even when the outcome is uncertain. That is a lesson more valuable than land or silver or safety bought through compromise. That night, after the horses were tended and the girls were asleep, Jim sat on the porch, watching stars emerge one by one from the darkening sky. Tyan joined him, moving with that characteristic quietness that made her seem more spirit than flesh sometimes. Thank you, she said, for today, for letting Emma claim me. You could have corrected her, preserved more distance, made things easier with the law. She spoke truth, Jim said simply. You've been more of a mother to them these past weeks than most women manage in years. Why would I correct truth? They sat in comfortable silence, the desert breathing around them. Somewhere a coyote called. Water moved in the irrigation ditch with gentle persistence. The night was vast and full of promise. Tomorrow they would continue building their case. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had allies. They had hope. They had each other. And in the hard country of the Arizona Territory, in a time when the world was changing whether anyone wanted it to or not, that was more than enough. It was everything. Fort Verde sat like a scar on the landscape, all hard angles and military precision imposed on land that had never asked for either. In the command office, Major Cyrus Blackwood stood before a map of the territory, his reflection caught in the window glass against the afternoon glare. 50 years old, and he looked every day of it, the desert sun having carved deep lines into his face like water cutting through stone. Behind him, 3 of his men waited. Not soldiers, not anymore. These were the ones who'd stayed after their commissions ended, who'd found that civilian life had no use for men whose only real skill was controlled violence. Tell me again, Blackwood said, not turning from the map. Exactly what happened in town. The youngest of the 3, a thick-necked man named Cord, shifted his weight nervously. Pike confronted them like you said, called out the Apache woman, insulted Brennan, was supposed to provoke a fight, give us cause to arrest him. And the daughter spoke up. The older one, Emma, called the Apache her mother, said it loud enough for half the town to hear. Blackwood's jaw tightened. And Brennan, he, correct her, deny it. No, sir, he backed her play. Stood there like it was the most natural thing in the world, his white daughter claiming a savage as kin. Silence filled the room, thick with implications. Blackwood finally turned, and there was something cold and calculating in his eyes, something that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with strategy. That's a mistake on his part, he said quietly. A big one. We can use that. How so, Major? This from Kane, the oldest of the 3, a man who'd followed Blackwood through 2 wars and a dozen skirmishes that would never make any history books. Because it gives us grounds, Legal grounds. A man who openly acknowledges an Apache woman as family, who lets his children call her mother, that's a man of questionable judgment. That's a man who might not be fit to raise white children in civilized society. Blackwood moved to his desk, pulling out paper and pen. We file with the territorial court. Petition for custody review. Argue moral unfitness. Brennan's got friends now, Cord pointed out. That Chinese woman gave him supplies on credit. The priest is talking about testifying. Even some of the townsfolk are starting to think maybe he's not so wrong. Friends, Blackwood repeated, making the word sound like a curse. Friends won't matter when we stack the deck properly. Judge Morrison may be fair-minded, but he's also bound by law. And the law is very clear about what constitutes proper guardianship. He began writing his hand, moving with practiced efficiency. We need witnesses, people who will testify that Brennan is unfit, that the Apache woman is dangerous. Who's going to testify to that? Kane asked. Everyone knows she saved the Brennan girl from that snake, knows she helped fight off our boys when they hit the ranch. Blackwood looked up, and his smile was thin and sharp as a knife blade. Then we find people who'll say otherwise, people who'll swear they saw her engage in savage rituals, who'll claim she threatened violence, who'll testify that she murdered soldiers during the Apache Wars. But that's a lie, Cord said, then flinched when Blackwood's gaze fixed on him. Truth is what can be proven in court, and I know men who'll swear to anything for the right price. He finished writing, folded the paper with crisp precision. There's a man in Tucson, former cavalry scout named Jessup. He'll say whatever we need him to say, especially if we make it worth his while. What about Brennan himself? Kane asked. He was an officer. Decorated? That carries weight. Was an officer? Blackwood emphasized. Past tense. And we'll make sure everyone remembers why he left the service. All those questions about his loyalty, his wife's mysterious background that nobody ever quite understood. We paint a picture of a man who was never quite sound, who's now completely lost his way. He moved back to the map, his finger tracing the boundaries of Brennan's land. And when the court rules in our favor, when they take those children and put them somewhere proper, somewhere white, Brennan will have nothing left to fight for. He'll sell. And if he doesn't, well. The finger tapped the land one final time. Accidents happen, especially to men who insist on making themselves obstacles. The three men exchanged glances. They'd followed Blackwood into dark places before, had done things that kept them awake some nights when the whiskey ran out too soon. But there was something about this that felt different. Something about targeting children that made even hardened men uncomfortable. Blackwood saw their hesitation, and his expression hardened. This is about more than land or silver. This is about maintaining order, about preserving the boundaries that keep civilization from descending into chaos. You let one white man openly claim kinship with Apache, next thing you know, you've got mixing everywhere. You've got the lines blurred so bad nobody knows where they stand anymore. Major Kane said carefully. Some folks might say the lines are already pretty blurred. Half the territory's got mixed blood if you look close enough. Then we don't look close, Blackwood snapped. We maintain the fiction. We enforce the rules. Because the alternative is admitting that everything we fought for, everything we killed for was built on sand. He took a breath, controlling himself. I was at Camp Grant. I gave the orders that cleansed that place. And I'd do it again tomorrow if I thought it would protect what we've built here. The admission hung in the air like smoke. They'd all suspected, but hearing it said aloud was different. Camp Grant wasn't war. It was massacre. Women and children. And Blackwood was admitting to it without a shred of remorse. The Apache woman, Cord said slowly. She was there, wasn't she? That's why you really want her gone. Blackwood's silence was answer enough. She's a witness, Kane breathed. She could testify about what really happened. She could try, Blackwood agreed. But who's going to believe an Apache over a decorated officer? Who's going to take the word of a savage over official military records? He smiled again, cold and certain. No one, because that's not how this world works. Power writes history, and I have the power. He handed Kane the letter he'd written. Get this to Jessup. Tell him there's $500 in it if he testifies exactly as instructed. And make sure he understands that failure to cooperate would be very unwise. As the men filed out, Blackwood returned to his window. Below Fort Verde bustled with activity. Soldiers drilling, supply wagons rolling in. The machinery of military occupation grinding forward with relentless momentum. Somewhere out there, Brennan thought he could win by gathering allies and building a legal case. But Blackwood had been playing this game for 30 years. He knew how to corrupt witnesses, how to stack courts, how to use the law as a weapon against those foolish enough to believe in its fairness. The Apache woman would hang. The children would be taken. The land would be his. It was only a matter of time. 3 days later, a wagon rolled up to Brennan's ranch just after dawn. Emma saw it first from her bedroom window and called down to her father with excitement in her voice. "Papa, someone's coming. It's Doc Hayes." Jim met the wagon in the yard, rifle in hand, out of habit relaxing when he recognized Ellen Hayes on the driver's seat. She was 48 years old, widowed for a decade, and had earned her medical degree back east before coming west to escape memories of a husband lost to consumption. The territorial towns were desperate enough for doctors that they'd overlooked her gender, though they'd never quite forgiven it. Doc Jim greeted her, helping her down. "Wasn't expecting you." "I wasn't expecting to come," Ellen replied, brushing dust from her practical skirts. "But I got to thinking about what you're up against, about what that woman of yours did for my patient last week." "Your patient, Miguel Rodriguez, the ranch hand who got trampled. His leg was infected, gangrene setting in. I was about to amputate when your tie-in sent over a poultice, some mix of herbs I'd never seen before." Ellen's expression was equal parts impressed and chagrined. "Saved the leg. Maybe saved his life. Made me realize I don't know half what I think I know about medicine." Tie-in had emerged from the house, drawn by the voices. She stood on the porch, morning light catching in her dark hair, watching this new arrival with her characteristic wariness. Ellen looked at her directly. No hesitation, no disgust, just professional interest. "I want to learn," she said simply. "Your medicines, your techniques, whatever you're willing to teach me." The offer hung in the air. Jim could see Tie-in processing it, looking for the trap, the ulterior motive. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Come," Tie-in said. "I will show you." They spent the morning in what Tie-in had turned into a workshop, a corner of the barn, where she'd hung herbs to dry and stored roots in labeled jars. Ellen took notes in a leather-bound journal, her handwriting precise and quick, as Tie-in explained which plants reduced fever, which fought infection, which could be used to manage pain when laudanum wasn't available or couldn't be trusted. "This one," Tie-in said, holding up a twisted root, "we call it bear root. Your people might call it osha. It treats cough-lung sickness. You make tea very bitter, but it works when other things fail." Ellen examined the root, sketching it carefully. "And this grows wild around here, if you know where to look, high places where water runs in spring. The plant likes to hide." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Ellen asking questions, Tie-in answering with the patience of someone who'd been a teacher long before she'd become a refugee. Jim, watching from the barn door, saw something shift between them. Recognition of competence. Respect earned through knowledge rather than granted by social convention. "Can I ask you something?" Ellen said eventually, setting down her journal. "Why are you helping me? I'm white. My people killed your people. Why share this?" Tie-in's hands stilled in their work. "Because sickness does not care about skin color. Because a child with fever is just a child with fever, whether Apache or white or Mexican or Chinese. Medicine should not be a weapon hoarded by one group against another. It should be a bridge." "You're a better person than I am," Ellen said quietly. "I'm not sure I could be so generous if our positions were reversed." "You are here learning from someone the world calls savage. That is generous enough." Tie-in mixed something in a bowl, the herbs releasing a sharp, clean scent. "Besides, I am not being selfless. If more doctors know Apache medicine, more people live. That is its own revenge against those who try to erase us." Ellen laughed, surprised and delighted. "Revenge through healing? I like that." They broke for lunch, and Grace insisted Ellen sit with them. The meal was simple but plentiful, and for a little while the barn felt less like a refuge and more like a home. Ellen told stories about her medical training, about professors who'd tried to discourage her, and patients who'd initially refused treatment from a woman. "And now?" Emma asked, fascinated. "Do they still refuse?" "Some do, but most have learned that pride is a luxury you can't afford when you're bleeding or burning with fever." Ellen smiled. "Desperation makes people practical real quick." After lunch, Tie-in showed Ellen how to prepare a salve for burns, mixing bear grease with certain powdered leaves. Their heads bent together over the work, and Jim was struck by the sight of them. Two women from completely different worlds finding common ground in the shared language of healing. "I'll testify," Ellen said suddenly, "at the hearing, about your medical knowledge, your character, about how you've helped people in this territory regardless of who they were." Tie-in looked up, surprise flickering across her usually controlled features. "That will make trouble for you. Blackwood will not forgive it." "Let him try. I'm the only doctor within 50 miles. He needs me more than I need his approval." Ellen's jaw set with determination. "Besides, I didn't come west to play it safe. I came because back east women like me couldn't practice medicine at all. Out here we get to make our own rules sometimes. Seems a shame to waste that freedom." That evening, as Ellen prepared to leave, she pulled Jim aside. Blackwood's hiring false witnesses. I heard it from a patient who works at the fort, some man from Tucson named Jessup. He's going to claim he saw Tyan kill soldiers during the wars. Jim's blood went cold. When? Soon. Maybe within the week. He's preparing a whole case against you. Custody petition, character assassination, the works. Ellen gripped his arm. You need better allies than you've got. You need someone who can counter Blackwood's legal maneuvering, who every lawyer in the territory is either bought by him or scared of him. Then you need to look outside the territory, or you need someone Blackwood can't touch. Ellen climbed into her wagon, gathering the reins. There are people who owe you, Jim, from your Army days. Maybe it's time to call in some of those debts. She drove off, leaving Jim to stare after her wagon as it disappeared into the gathering dusk. He was still standing there when he heard horses approaching from the opposite direction, one rider moving slowly, carefully. Not the aggressive pace of attackers, but the deliberate speed of someone who wanted to be seen coming from a long way off. The rider materialized out of the twilight like something from a half-remembered dream. An old man Apache, by the look of him, dressed in traditional clothing mixed with pieces of white man's gear. His horse was a paint well cared for despite its age, and his face, weathered by 7 decades of desert sun and sorrow, carried a dignity that made Jim straighten unconsciously. Tyan had come out of the barn and stood frozen, staring at the approaching rider. Then she whispered something in Apache, her voice cracking with disbelief. The old man dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose bones remembered injuries long healed. He looked at Tyan for a long moment, and something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, a conversation conducted entirely in silence. "You are James Brennan," the old man said, his English accented but clear. "Husband of my daughter Margaret, father of my granddaughters." Jim felt the ground shift beneath him. "Red Skywalker. I received Margaret's letter 3 months ago. She wrote it before she died, asked a friend to mail it if anything happened to her. It took time to find me, more time to arrange to come here." Red Skywalker's gaze moved to Emma and Grace, who'd emerged from the house. "My daughter's children. They have her eyes." Emma approached cautiously, studying this stranger who claimed kinship. "Mama never talked about you. She could not. To speak of me would be to admit what she was, and that admission would have destroyed the life she built." No bitterness in his voice, just acceptance of hard truths. "But she loved you. That much was clear in every word she wrote. And she died asking your father to protect those like her. Like us. Like Tyan." He turned to Tyan, then speaking rapidly, in Apache. She answered in the same language, her usually controlled voice thick with emotion. The conversation went on for several minutes while Jim and his daughters waited, understanding nothing but feeling the weight of whatever was being said. Finally, Red Skywalker switched back to English. "Tyan tells me you have given her shelter, that you have claimed her as family despite the cost, that you are fighting against Cyrus Blackwood." "We're trying," Jim said. "It's not going well." "Blackwood," Red Skywalker spat the name like poison. "I know this man. I know what he did at Camp Grant. I was one of the warriors who returned to find our families dead. I saw the bodies of children. I heard Tyan describe the voice of the man who gave orders. You were there. I came too late to fight, but not too late to remember." The old man's eyes were hard as flint. "Blackwood commanded that massacre. He has never been punished, and now he wants to destroy you because you protect a witness to his crime." The revelation settled over them like a shroud. This wasn't just about land or silver or social boundaries. This was about a man trying to bury evidence of his own atrocity. "We're gathering testimony," Jim said, "building a legal case. But it's not enough. Blackwood has money connections. He's hiring false witnesses to testify against Tyan." "Then you need true witnesses," Red Skywalker said. "You need proof that cannot be denied." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather packet, aged and worn. "Margaret sent this to me. Letters Blackwood wrote after Camp Grant, bragging letters sent to a friend who later sold them to a trader who sold them to me. I have kept them waiting for the right moment to use them." Jim took the packet with trembling hands. Inside were 3 letters, the paper yellowed, but the ink still clear. He began to read, and with each line his horror grew. Blackwood describing the massacre in casual detail, boasting about the body count, joking about the screams. "This is evidence," Jim breathed. "This could destroy him." "It could also get you killed," Red Skywalker warned. "A man who would order the murder of women and children will not hesitate to kill to protect his reputation. You must be very careful how you use this." Emma had been listening intently, her young face serious, beyond her years. "We have to use it at the trial. We have to make everyone see what he really is." "The trial may not be fair," Red Skywalker said gently. "White man's justice rarely is when the powerful are accused." Then we make it fair, Grace said, her small voice fierce. We make them listen. Tyan knelt beside the child, taking her hands. Little one, sometimes courage is not enough. But sometimes it is, Grace insisted. You said so. You said being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what's right anyway. Red Skywalker smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. My daughter chose well when she married into this family. These children have warrior hearts. That night they made plans around the kitchen table. Red Skywalker would stay, would add his testimony to the others. The letters would be held in reserve, used only if absolutely necessary, because showing them too soon would give Blackwood time to destroy or discredit them. We're building something, Jim said, looking around the table at his unlikely family. We're building a case that even the territory can't ignore. We are building more than that, Tyan said quietly. We are building proof that family is not about blood, that honor can exist between enemies, that justice is possible even in an unjust world. Red Skywalker nodded. And if we fail, if Blackwood wins, at least we will have tried. At least the children will know that their father and their mothers fought for what was right. Mothers plural. The word hung in the air, acknowledged and accepted. Emma and Grace had two mothers now, one buried beneath the cottonwood tree, one sitting at this table, planning rebellion. Outside, the desert night sang its eternal song. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns older than nations or laws or the petty cruelties of small-minded men. And in a ranch house in the middle of nowhere, a family that shouldn't exist prepared to fight a battle they couldn't afford to lose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow Blackwood's false witness might arrive. Tomorrow the legal machinery might grind forward with its inexorable weight. But tonight they had hope. They had truth. They had each other. And in the end, that might just be enough. The summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous young clerk from the territorial court who wouldn't meet Jim's eyes. The paper was official stamped and sealed the language formal and cold. The hearing would be held in 7 days. Judge Theodore Morrison presiding. The matter of custody and guardianship of Emma and Grace Brennan, with additional charges of harboring a fugitive and moral unfitness. Jim read it twice, then handed it to Tyan without comment. She scanned the document, her face revealing nothing, but he saw the way her fingers tightened on the paper's edge. 7 days, she said quietly. 7 days to build a case that can stand against everything Blackwood will throw at us. Jim looked out the window where Emma and Grace were feeding the chickens their laughter, carrying on the morning breeze. Innocent, unaware that in 1 week their entire world might be torn apart. That afternoon, Marshal Holloway's office became a war room. They gathered there, this unlikely coalition of the desperate and the determined. Ben Holloway sat behind his desk, gray hair catching the light from the window. Father Santos occupied a wooden chair, his weathered hands folded in prayer or contemplation. Doc Ellen Hayes stood near the filing cabinet, medical bag at her feet as if she'd come straight from a patient. Red Skywalker leaned against the wall, his presence both anchor and reminder of what they were really fighting for. And Jim, with Tyan beside him, spread the letters on Holloway's desk like playing cards in a high-stakes game. This is what we have, Jim said. 3 letters written by Blackwood in 1871, right after Camp Grant, describing the massacre in his own words, boasting about it. Holloway read them slowly, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he looked up, and there was something like fury in his usually calm eyes. This is a confession. This is evidence of war crimes. If we present this correctly, we can destroy him. If we present it at all, Ellen interjected. The moment Blackwood knows we have these letters, he'll do everything in his power to discredit them, claim they're forgeries, produce witnesses who'll swear he was somewhere else. He's had 30 years to build his version of history. Then we need to be strategic, Father Santos said, his accented voice carrying unexpected steel. We do not show our strongest hand until he has committed himself to his lies. Let him testify first. Let him swear under oath that he had nothing to do with Camp Grant. Then we produce the letters and watch him hang himself with his own words. Red Skywalker nodded slowly. This is wise. A liar who has sworn to truth in front of many witnesses cannot easily escape when proof contradicts him. But we need more than just the letters, Holloway said. We need witnesses. People who can testify to Tyan's character, to Jim's fitness as a father, to the lies Blackwood is spreading. I will testify, Ellen said immediately, about Tyan's medical knowledge, about the lives she saved, about her character. As will I, Father Santos added, about her kindness, about the way she has lived with dignity despite persecution. And I, Red Skywalker said, will testify about what I saw when I returned to Camp Grant, about the bodies of women and children, About Blackwood's voice giving orders. Tyan had been silent through most of this, but now she spoke, her voice low and steady. I will testify about what I heard, about hiding in the rocks while my family was murdered, about the voice I have never forgotten. Jim looked at her, seeing the cost of that offer written in the tension of her jaw, the shadows in her eyes. To speak publicly about Camp Grant meant reliving it, meant standing before a room full of strangers and exposing the rawest wound of her life. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. Yes, I do. For the ones who cannot speak, for the mothers and children whose voices were silenced, for your daughters who deserve to know that truth matters more than comfort. The room fell silent, each of them feeling the weight of what they were about to attempt. They weren't just fighting for custody of 2 girls. They were fighting against 30 years of accepted lies, against a system designed to protect men like Blackwood, against the comfortable fiction that conquest had been clean and justified. We need more, Holloway said finally. More witnesses, more proof. Blackwood will bring people who'll swear Jim is unfit, that Tyan is dangerous. We need to counter that with such overwhelming testimony that even a biased court can't ignore it. Then we go to the community, Jim said. We tell them what's happening. We ask them to stand with us. Will they? Ellen asked. Most of these people are terrified of Blackwood. They've seen what he does to those who oppose him. Some will be too afraid, Red Skywalker acknowledged. But not all. Fear and courage exist in the same heart. Sometimes all that is needed is someone to show courage first. That evening, Jim sat down with his daughters and explained what was coming. Emma listened with her characteristic seriousness, asking sharp questions about legal procedure and what would happen if they lost. Grace curled against Tyan's small fingers wrapped in the woman's sleeve. Will they take us away? Grace asked, her voice very small. They might try, Jim answered honestly, but we're going to fight. We're going to show the judge that our family is strong and good, even if it doesn't look like other families. Because Tyan is Apache, Emma said. Not a question, a statement of fact she'd already processed and accepted. Because I chose to protect someone who needed protection. Because your mother asked me to. Because it was the right thing to do. Emma nodded slowly. What do you need us to do? The question, delivered with such calm certainty, nearly broke Jim's composure. 11 years old, and already she understood that this was a battle they would fight together. I need you to be brave, he said, and I need you to tell the truth. If the judge asks you questions, you answer honestly. Can you do that? Yes, Papa. Grace. The younger girl nodded against Tyan's side. Will you still be here after the trial? Tyan's hand came up to stroke Grace's hair, the gesture automatic and tender. I will be here as long as your father allows it, as long as you want me to be. Forever then, Grace said, simply, and the certainty in her voice was like a benediction. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and growing tension. Word spread through Verde Falls about the upcoming trial, and the town divided along invisible lines. Some people crossed the street to avoid Jim when he came for supplies. Others nodded cautiously, unwilling to commit, but not actively hostile. Then, on the 3rd day, something unexpected happened. Sarah Chen appeared at the ranch just after dawn, her wagon loaded with food. Behind her came 3 more wagons, then 5, then 10. Families Jim recognized, and some he didn't. Mexicans from the settlement south of town, a black family who ran a freight business, poor white farmers who worked land that Blackwood wanted to claim, Chinese laborers from the railroad camps, 23 families in all, converging on the Brennan Ranch like rivers flowing toward the sea. They came bearing gifts, food mostly, cornmeal and beans, fresh bread and preserved fruit, a young pig squealing in a crate. But more than food, they brought presents, solidarity, the unspoken declaration that Jim and Tyan did not stand alone. Sarah Chen organized it all with quiet efficiency, directing people where to set up, ensuring the children had space to play while the adults talked. Jim stood on his porch watching this impromptu gathering, overwhelmed by the simple fact of it. Marshal Holloway arrived mid-morning, taking in the scene with something like wonder. Well, he said to Jim, looks like you've got yourself a movement. I didn't ask for this. The best movements are usually the ones nobody asks for. They just happen when enough people get tired of being afraid. Father Santos moved through the crowd, blessing children and speaking words of encouragement in Spanish and English and sometimes Apache. Doc Hayes set up an impromptu clinic under a cottonwood tree, treating minor ailments and listening to stories of Blackwood's cruelties. Each person there had their own grievance, their own reason for standing against a man who'd made himself untouchable through fear. Red Skywalker sat with a group of Mexican elders conversing in a mixture of Spanish and hand signs, finding common ground in shared experiences of displacement and survival. Tyen moved among the women, teaching them how to prepare certain herbs, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Apache healers. And through it all, Emma and Grace played with children of every color, their laughter a counterpoint to the serious conversations happening around them. They were too young to fully understand the weight of what was coming, but old enough to sense that something important was building here. Something that transcended individual families and touched on larger questions of justice and belonging. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, people began to speak. One by one they stood and told their stories. A Mexican farmer talked about how Blackwood had tried to force him off his land, threatening violence when legal intimidation failed. A Chinese woman described working at the fort watching Blackwood deny medical care to Apache prisoners until they died from easily treatable illnesses. A black teamster recounted being cheated out of wages, then beaten when he dared to complain. The stories accumulated like evidence in a trial that hadn't yet begun, each one a small piece of a larger pattern, each one proof that Blackwood's cruelty was not isolated or accidental, but systematic and deliberate. When the testimonies finally wound down, it was mid-afternoon. People sat in small groups sharing food and water, children dozing in the shade. The mood had shifted from nervous energy to something more solid. Determination. Resolve. Jim stood before them, hat in hand, searching for words adequate to the moment. "I don't know how to thank you," he began. "Most of you don't know me well. Some of you don't know me at all, but you came anyway. You stood up when standing up meant risking everything." "We came because it was time," Sarah Chen said quietly. "Because if we don't stand together now, we'll be picked off one by one until there's nobody left to stand at all." "Blackwood thinks he's untouchable," the Mexican farmer added. "Maybe he is, but at least he'll know we tried. At least our children will see that we didn't just accept injustice quietly." An older man Jim didn't recognize stood slowly leaning on a cane carved from mesquite. "I was at Camp Grant," he said, his voice carrying despite its softness. "Not as a soldier, as a scout. I saw what was done there. I have carried that shame for 30 years, too afraid to speak. But I will speak now. I will testify about what I witnessed." The revelation sent a ripple through the crowd. Here was an eyewitness. Here was someone who could corroborate Tyen's testimony, who could give weight to Red Skywalker's words. Holloway stepped forward. "You understand what you're offering. Blackwood will come after you. Hard." "I am 73 years old," the man said. "My life is already behind me. Blackwood's threats mean nothing to a man with more days in the grave than ahead of him. Let him try. At least I will die having told the truth." As afternoon faded into evening, the gathering took on the quality of a celebration. Someone produced a guitar. Another person brought out a fiddle. Music filled the air, simple and joyful, and people began to dance. Mexican corridos mixed with Irish jigs, Apache chants blending with Chinese melodies, creating something new and strange and beautiful. Grace stood at the center of it all, watching with wide eyes. Then, without prompting, she began to sing the Apache lullaby. Tyen had taught her the one about the moon and stars and the endless patience of the desert. Her voice was small but clear, carrying across the sudden quiet that fell when people realized what they were hearing. A white child singing in Apache, a bridge built from music and innocence, and the simple refusal to accept that love must be bounded by language or blood. Tyen's eyes shone with unshed tears. Red Skywalker bowed his head, lips moving in what might have been prayer or simply gratitude. And Jim felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he'd built without realizing crumbling under the weight of this moment. When Grace finished, the silence held for 3 heartbeats. Then someone began to clap, then another. Then the whole gathering erupted in applause, and Grace beamed with the unself-conscious joy of a child who has given a gift and seen it received with love. As darkness fell and families began to depart, each one stopped to speak with Jim, to shake his hand or embrace him, to promise they would be at the trial, to swear they would stand witness no matter the cost. "We will be there," they said over and over. "We will stand with you." Finally, the last wagon rolled away, leaving only firelight and stars, and the 4 of them. Jim, Tyen, Emma, and Grace. Red Skywalker had retired to the barn, giving them privacy. Father Santos and Doc Hayes had left with promises to return for the trial. They sat around the fire pit Jim had built years ago when Margaret was still alive, and the future had seemed simpler. Emma and Grace leaned against each other, exhausted by the day's emotions, but not quite ready to sleep. "Papa," Emma said drowsily, "are we going to win?" It was Grace who had asked this question before, but now Emma wanted reassurance too. Needed to hear her father say something hopeful, even if he couldn't promise certainty. "I think we have a real chance," Jim said carefully. "We have good people standing with us. We have truth on our side. That doesn't guarantee victory, but it gives us something to fight with." "What if we lose?" Emma pressed. "What happens to us if we lose? They might try to take you away, put you with families they think are more suitable." Jim's voice roughened. "But I will fight that too. I will appeal. I will do everything the law allows and some things it doesn't. I will not stop fighting for you." "And Tyen?" Grace asked. "What happens to her?" The question hung heavy. They all knew the answer. If Jim lost custody, Tyen would be arrested, tried for fabricated crimes, at best sent to a reservation, at worst executed. "I will run," Tyen said quietly. "I have run before. I can disappear into the desert where they cannot follow." "No!" Grace sat up, suddenly fierce. "You can't leave us. Little one, sometimes leaving is the only way to protect those we love." "That's not true. You told me being brave means staying even when you're scared. You have to stay. You have to fight with us." Tyen looked at Jim, a question in her eyes. He nodded slowly. "We fight together," he said. "All of us. And whatever happens, we face it as a family." Emma shifted closer, her head resting on Tyen's shoulder. "You're really our mother now, aren't you? If you will have me, if your father allows it." "Papa." Emma's voice was muffled against fabric, but clear enough. Jim looked at these three people who had become his entire world. His blood daughters, and the woman who had somehow impossibly become essential to their survival. The woman who had taught them courage and dignity, and the stubborn insistence that love could cross any boundary if you were brave enough to let it. "She's family," he said simply. "Has been since the day Grace called her mother, and I didn't correct it. Maybe before that. Family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up, who stays, who fights beside you when the world says you should stand alone." Tyen reached across the fire and took his hand. Just that. A simple gesture that felt like an earthquake. Grace saw it and smiled. Emma nodded as if some internal calculation had finally balanced. They sat there as the fire burned low, the desert night vast and star-filled around them. Tomorrow they would finalize their strategy. Tomorrow they would review testimony and prepare for battle. But tonight they were simply together. A family that shouldn't exist by any conventional measure, but did anyway, held together by choice and courage and love that refused to be bound by the lines others had drawn. "Thank you," Tyen said softly, her hand still in Jim's, "for giving me something I thought I had lost forever." "What's that?" "A reason to hope. A reason to believe the world can be better than it has been." Jim squeezed her hand gently. "I should be thanking you. You gave my daughters their laughter back. You gave this house life again. You reminded me that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is let himself be changed by what he doesn't understand." The fire crackled. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. And somewhere in the distance a coyote sang its lonely song, answered by another, then another, until the night was full of their calling. In 3 days they would walk into that courthouse. In 3 days they would face down a corrupt system and a powerful man who had never learned that some things were more important than control. In 3 days the world would try to tear them apart. But tonight the world could wait. Tonight they had fire and stars and each other. And tomorrow, when the sun rose blood red over the Arizona territory, they would rise with it, ready to fight, ready to speak truth, ready to prove that justice was possible even when every odd was stacked against it, ready to show that love, when it was true and fierce and willing to stand in the fire, could not be defeated by laws or prejudice or the petty cruelties of men who mistook power for righteousness. The trial would come, the battle would be joined, but they would face it together, this impossible family, and that made all the difference. The courthouse in Verde Falls was built from adobe and ambition, a structure meant to impose order on a territory that had never asked for it. On the morning of the trial, it filled early. People packed the benches, stood along the walls, crowded the doorway. News had spread through the territory like wildfire, and everyone wanted to witness what came next. Jim arrived with his family an hour before the scheduled start. Emma wore her best dress, the blue one Margaret had made 2 years ago, that was already getting short in the sleeves. Grace held Tyen's hand so tightly their knuckles were white. Tyen herself wore simple clothing, her hair braided in the traditional Apache way, her face composed into a mask of calm that didn't quite hide the tension in her jaw. Red Skywalker walked beside them, his presence both shield and statement. Behind them came the witnesses, Father Santos in his black cassock, Dr. Ellen Hayes carrying her medical bag like a badge of authority, Marshal Holloway in his best coat badge polished to shine, and behind them, the 23 families who had gathered at the ranch filing in to fill every available space. Judge Theodore Morrison entered at precisely 9 o'clock, his black robe severe against the whitewashed walls. He was 60 years old with the kind of weathered face that could have belonged to a prospector or a prophet. His reputation was for fairness, but fairness within a system designed to favor men like Blackwood. Jim watched him take his seat and wondered if that reputation would hold when tested by evidence that contradicted everything the judge had been taught to believe. Blackwood sat at the prosecutor's table with 2 lawyers from Tucson, expensive men in expensive suits. He looked confident, almost bored, as if the outcome were already decided. Luther Pike and several other Fort soldiers sat behind him, ready to testify to whatever lies had been purchased with Blackwood's silver. The bailiff read the charges: moral unfitness, harboring a fugitive, endangering the welfare of minors by exposing them to savage influences. Each accusation landed like a stone thrown into still water ripples of reaction moving through the crowded room. "Mr. Brennan," Judge Morrison said, "you stand accused of being unfit to raise your daughters due to your association with the Apache woman known as Tayen. How do you plead?" Jim stood feeling the weight of every eye in the courthouse. "Not guilty, Your Honor, and I'd like to state for the record that Tayen is not just an association. She is family. She is the woman my daughters have chosen as their mother, and I support that choice completely." A murmur ran through the crowd. Blackwood's lawyers exchanged satisfied glances. They'd been hoping Jim would make exactly that admission. "Then let us proceed," Morrison said. "Major Blackwood, your witnesses may begin." The prosecution's case unfolded with practiced precision. A series of townspeople testified about Jim's changed behavior, his withdrawal from social functions, his open defiance of proper boundaries. Then came the false witness, a man named Jessup, who swore he'd seen Tayen kill 2 soldiers during an Apache raid in '72. "Describe what you saw," Blackwood's lead lawyer prompted. "She came out of nowhere like a demon. Cut the first man's throat before he could raise his rifle, shot the second one point blank." Jessup's voice was steady, rehearsed. "I'll never forget her face, that savage look in her eyes." "And you're certain it was this woman?" The lawyer pointed at Tayen. "Certain as I'm standing here." Marshal Holloway leaned close to Jim. "He's lying. I checked the records. There was no raid in '72 where he claims, and the 2 soldiers he named both died of cholera at Fort Apache." "Can you prove it?" Jim whispered back. "I can try." When Holloway took the stand for the defense, he methodically dismantled Jessup's testimony with military records and death certificates. But Blackwood's lawyers countered with questions about the reliability of old paperwork, about whether records could have been lost or misfiled. They created just enough doubt to make Jessup's lies seem plausible. Then it was Emma's turn. She walked to the witness stand with her back straight and her chin up, looking far older than 11. The bailiff swore her in, and she placed her small hand on the Bible without hesitation. "Emma," Judge Morrison said gently, "I know this is frightening, but I need you to answer some questions truthfully. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." Blackwood's lawyer stood all false sympathy and calculated cruelty. "Emma, do you love your father?" "Of course." "And would you do anything to help him even lie?" "I wouldn't lie. Papa taught me that truth matters more than comfort." "Very noble. Now this Apache woman your father has brought into your home, are you afraid of her?" Emma's eyes flashed. "No, not even a little. She's a savage after all. Surely you must worry about your safety." "She's not a savage. She's the bravest, kindest person I know, besides my papa, and she's saved my sister's life twice, once from a snake and once from being sad all the time after Mama died." The lawyer's smile thinned. "Your father told you to say that, didn't he?" "Nobody tells me what to say. I'm telling you what's true." Emma turned to face Judge Morrison directly. "Tayen is my mother now. Not because Papa said so, because I chose her, because she showed up when we needed someone and she never left, because family isn't just about blood. It's about who takes care of you when you're scared and who teaches you to be strong." A ripple of emotion moved through the courtroom. Jim saw several women wiping their eyes. Even Morrison's stern face softened slightly. "One more question," the lawyer said, sensing he was losing ground. "If the court decides your father is unfit, if you're sent to live with a proper family, would you obey?" Emma met his gaze without flinching. "I would run away. I would keep running until I found my way back home. Because home isn't a place. It's the people who love you, even when the world says they shouldn't." The lawyer sat down, his strategy in ruins. Emma returned to her seat, and Grace immediately climbed into her lap, both girls drawing strength from each other. Father Santos testified next. speaking about Tyen's character, her kindness to the sick and poor, her quiet dignity in the face of persecution. Doc Hayes followed, providing medical testimony about Tyen's healing knowledge, the lives she'd saved through Apache medicine that white doctors would have dismissed as superstition. Then it was Tyen's turn. She stood and walked to the witness stand with the same controlled grace she brought to everything. But Jim could see the cost in the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly before she clasped them together. The bailiff held out the Bible. Tyen looked at it for a long moment. "I will swear on this book if required," she said quietly, "but know that my people have other ways of binding ourselves to truth. I swear by the earth that holds my mother's bones. I swear by the sky that witnessed my family's murder. I swear by the lives of these children who have given me reason to hope again. I will speak only truth." Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "That will suffice. Proceed." Jim's lawyer, a young man from Prescott who'd agreed to take the case for almost nothing, stood. "Miss Tyen, can you tell the court about Camp Grant?" The courtroom went silent. Even Blackwood leaned forward, his confident facade cracking slightly. Tyen began to speak. Her voice was low but clear, each word chosen with the precision of someone who knew that this testimony would either save or doom them all. April 30th, 1871. I was 19 years old. My people were living under Army protection at Camp Grant. We believed we were safe. The men had gone hunting. I had left early to gather medicine plants in the mountains. She paused, gathering herself. When I returned, I heard screaming. I hid in the rocks and watched as more than 100 attackers fell upon our camp. They killed women. They killed children. They killed old men who could not defend themselves. They took the surviving babies to sell as slaves. "How many died?" the lawyer asked softly. 144. Most were women and children under 12 years old. A collective gasp ran through the courtroom. Even those who'd heard rumors about Camp Grant seemed shocked by the specific number, the confirmation of atrocity. "And during this attack, did you hear the voice of the man in charge?" "Yes, he was giving orders, directing the killing. He was laughing." "Do you hear that voice in this courtroom now?" Tyen turned and looked directly at Blackwood. "Yes, I hear it every time Major Blackwood speaks. I have never forgotten it." Blackwood surged to his feet. "That's a lie. I was nowhere near Camp Grant." "Major Blackwood," Judge Morrison said sharply, "you will have your chance to testify. Sit down." But Blackwood was beyond reason now, his careful control shattered by the direct accusation. "She's a lying Apache whore. You can't believe anything she says." "Major," Morrison's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "One more outburst, and I will hold you in contempt." Red Sky Walker stood, then his old voice carrying authority that silenced the room. "I have evidence. Letters written by Major Blackwood after Camp Grant, describing the massacre, boasting about his role in it." He produced the leather packet and handed it to the bailiff, who carried it to Judge Morrison. The judge read the first letter, his face growing darker with each line. Then the second. Then the third. When he looked up, his eyes found Blackwood, and there was something like horror in them. "Major Blackwood, did you write these letters?" Blackwood's face had gone white. Those are forgeries. Someone is trying to frame me." "The paper is consistent with 1871, Morrison said. "The ink is aged appropriately, and the handwriting matches samples of your official correspondence that I've seen." He set the letters down carefully. "These appear to be genuine." "You can't trust Apache testimony," Blackwood shouted. "You can't trust letters that could have been stolen, altered, I demand." "What you demand is irrelevant," Morrison cut him off. "What matters is what can be proven. And based on what I've heard today, there are serious questions about your character and your fitness to level accusations against Mr. Brennan." Blackwood's hand moved to his hip fingers, closing around the pistol he'd worn, despite courthouse regulations. "This is a farce. You're letting savages and savage lovers corrupt justice itself." He drew the weapon, and chaos erupted. Marshal Holloway reached for his own gun. Father Santos threw himself in front of the nearest children. People screamed and dove for cover, and Blackwood, his face twisted with rage and desperation, pointed the pistol directly at Tyen. "You should have died with the rest of them." Jim moved without thinking, his body acting on instinct refined through years of combat. He threw himself between Blackwood and Tyen just as the major fired. The bullet caught him high on the left shoulder, spinning him around. He hit the floor hard, pain exploding through his chest. Above him, he heard Tyen scream his name, heard Holloway's gun fire once, twice, heard Blackwood cry out, and the clatter of a weapon falling. Then Tyen was there, her hands pressing against his wound, her face hovering over his. "Stay with me. Do not leave these children. Do not leave me." "Not planning on it," Jim managed, though the words came out slurred. "Just needed to make sure you were safe." Foolish man, brave, beautiful, foolish man. Marshal Holloway had Blackwood on the floor knee in his back hands, being shackled behind him. Luther Pike and the other fort soldiers made no move to help their commander, shocked into stillness by the sight of their untouchable major brought low. Judge Morrison's voice cut through the chaos. "Someone get Doc Hayes up here. Bailiff, take Major Blackwood into custody. Charges of attempted murder, perjury, and," he looked at the letters again, "war crimes. He'll be held without bail pending a full investigation." Ellen Hayes was already kneeling beside Jim, her medical bag open, hands moving with practiced efficiency. "The bullet went through. Missed the bone, missed the major vessels. You'll live, though you'll wish you hadn't for the next few weeks." "Good enough," Jim breathed. Emma and Grace had broken through the crowd and were clutching at Tayan, both crying. She gathered them close with one arm while keeping pressure on Jim's wound with the other. "Is Papa going to die?" Grace sobbed. "No, little one. Your father is too stubborn to die, too stubborn and too necessary." Judge Morrison had restored some semblance of order. He looked around the courtroom, taking in the shocked faces, the overturned benches, the blood on the floor. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute authority. "In all my years on the bench, I have never witnessed such a display. Major Blackwood has shown himself to be exactly what the defense claimed, a violent man willing to commit murder to protect his reputation." He turned to Jim, still being tended by Doc Hayes. "Mr. Brennan, your petition to retain custody of your daughters is granted. Furthermore, the charges against Miss Tayan are dismissed. Based on the evidence presented today, she is the victim here, not the criminal." A cheer went up from the assembled families, quickly hushed by Morrison's raised hand. "However," he continued, "I want to be clear. This decision is not a blanket endorsement of all mixed households or unmarried cohabitation. It is a recognition that in this specific case, these specific children are better served by remaining with their father and the woman they have chosen as their guardian. Let that distinction be noted for the record." It was a narrow victory, couched in careful language that wouldn't set too broad a precedent, but it was victory nonetheless. As they carried Jim out on a stretcher, Tayan walked beside him, her hand in his uninjured one. Emma and Grace followed, flanked by Red Skywalker and Father Santos. The crowd parted for them, and Jim saw respect in faces that had shown only suspicion before. Outside, the Arizona sun blazed in a cloudless sky. The same sun that had witnessed Camp Grant. The same sun that had looked down on 30 years of injustice. But today, for once, it also witnessed something else. Justice. Imperfect and hard, won but real. 6 months later, the ranch house stood golden in the late afternoon light. Jim's shoulder had healed well enough, though it ached when storms were coming. He stood on the porch watching Emma help 3 Apache children with their English lessons, while Grace demonstrated proper bandaging technique on a doll, mimicking Doc Hayes' careful instruction. Tayan emerged from the house, wiping flour from her hands. They'd married quietly 3 months ago in a ceremony that combined Apache tradition with territorial law, witnessed by everyone who'd stood with them in that courtroom. "The school is ready," she said, nodding toward the new building they'd constructed at the edge of the property. 27 students enrolled, Apache, Mexican, Chinese, white, all learning together. "Brennan Walker's school," Jim said, reading the sign he'd hung that morning. His wife's name combined with the name she'd chosen to honor Red Skywalker and the grandmother she'd never known. A bridge between worlds. "Your daughters are good teachers," Tayan observed. "Emma especially. She has patience I did not expect in one so young. They learned from the best." A wagon appeared on the horizon, and as it grew closer, Jim recognized Doc Hayes' familiar rig. She'd been making weekly visits, learning more Apache medicine, teaching Tayan more Western techniques, creating a synthesis that was saving lives across the territory. Behind her came 3 more families, refugees from reservations where conditions had become unbearable. Tayan had sent word through quiet channels that there was a place for those who needed sanctuary, that the Brennan Walker Ranch welcomed anyone willing to work hard and treat others with respect. "We're building something," Jim said quietly, "something that will outlast us." "We are building what should have always been," Tayan corrected. "A place where children of all colors learn together, where healing is shared instead of hoarded, where family is defined by love instead of law." She leaned against him, and he put his good arm around her shoulders. They stood there watching their impossible family grow, watching the future take shape in the laughter of children who would never understand why anyone had thought this was wrong. "Do you ever regret it?" Jim asked. "Everything you gave up to be here." Tayan was quiet for a moment, considering. "I gave up nothing. I gained everything. I gained daughters. I gained purpose. I gained you." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were clear. The woman who survived Camp Grant had nothing left to lose, but the woman who stands here now has everything to fight for. That is not loss, that is resurrection. As the sun set over the Arizona Territory, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, the Brennan Walker Ranch settled into its evening rhythms, lamps being lit, meals being prepared, stories being told in 3 languages around tables that had learned to hold more than one truth at a time. And if you listened carefully, beneath the sounds of daily life you might hear something else, the echo of a promise kept, the whisper of justice delayed but not denied, the quiet song of a family that had refused to break when the world insisted they should. They had fought. They had won. And in winning, they had proven that love, when it was fierce enough and true enough, could not be defeated by prejudice or power or the comfortable lies that men tell themselves to justify cruelty. The story would be told for generations, embellished perhaps, simplified in some versions, complicated in others, but at its heart would always be this truth. A soldier's daughters chose honor over comfort. A woman who had lost everything found reason to hope. And a man learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let your family look different from what you'd imagined. In the end, that was legacy enough.